session. All the materials, the slides from that session will be posted on the Learning Center. All of the materials from today's session will also be posted on the Learning Center. And so with that, one more logistical detail, and that is we encourage you to highly submit your questions. We have plenty of time at the end of this webinar for questions, so please submit your questions. And in addition, and this is just a little slide to show you how to type in your questions, so please type in your questions throughout. And in addition, at the very end of this webinar, we will have a brief evaluation poll that we would love to have your feedback. So with that, I will turn it over to Chantal. Chantal?
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Christina. And thank all of you for joining us again for part 2 of the Motivational Interviewing and Rapport Building webinar. And for those of you who were not with us last week, thanks for joining us. So we're going to just do a quick review of some of the things that we touched on last week, but as Christina said, that entire module will be available in the Learning Center, so you'll be able to review it at your leisure. And then today we're going to talk about part 2 of the motivational interviewing phases of evoking and moving. We're also going to discuss some reflections from the OCAP video, so I'm hopeful that a number of you were able to review that. We'll also talk a little bit about some of the tenets of active listening and reflective affirmation, which is integral to the process of motivational interviewing. And we'll review several different methods for asking questions and gathering client information. As Christina said, we're happy to answer any questions that you have. Please feel free to put any questions that you have throughout into the chat box, and we'll answer those as quickly as we can. Some of those we may save until the end of the webinar so that we can answer them all together. But we do want this to be as interactive as a webinar can possibly be. We know that's difficult, particularly when you only have one voice that's going to drone on for an hour or so. So I appreciate everyone's participation and engagement as we go through the process. As you have questions, please type those into the chat box, and then hopefully we'll get an opportunity to engage with a full-fledged of question and answers at the end of the session. So for those of you who were able to review the OCAP video, I'd like to get a couple of reflections from folks out there in the field about some of the observations that you had regarding the case manager's conduct throughout the interview process. If you were with us last week, one of the things that I asked you to particularly look at is opportunities that he could have used motivational interviewing and did not. So if you wouldn't mind typing your answers into the chat box if you have some observations about that video and opportunities where the case manager could have used motivational interviewing and did not, or any other observations that you walked away with after you reviewed the video. Please feel free to type your answers into the chat box now. Okay, we're getting some really good answers. One of the interesting things that someone typed is that the interviewer didn't know the client's name in the beginning, and it's going to be really difficult to engage that client is when you meet them, you haven't at least taken a minute to find out who they are, or at least ask them what their name is and you know, taken an opportunity to get some initial information. The case manager was very distracted and wasn't really paying attention to the client. He definitely missed an opportunity when the participant said there were safety issues at home and he didn't ask more questions or go into more depth. He ended their appointment quite abruptly, absolutely. He seemed very rude and dismissive. When she shared her history about domestic violence, he could have asked additional questions and he didn't. Let's see what someone said he was really checked out during the entire interview. The first interview seemed rushed, and he was distracted by the computer. The case manager was very unattentive and careless of the sensitive questions he was asking the client. He was not engaging with the customer. He didn't engage with the participant, no empathy for the subject of domestic violence that came up, and no follow-up questions. He also seemed annoyed at the beginning when the client did not have enough time and he answered the telephone. So all of you are kind of in the same realm. There's a combination of there wasn't really engagement going on. There wasn't a real conversation happening between the case manager and the client. It was definitely more a question and answer session. He had an opportunity to go into more depth and did not. Appeared very distracted. Now, from that scenario, we can't really ascertain whether that case manager cares about the client that's in front of him. We're going to assume that he's a good person and that he cares about his job. But for some reason, there was a disconnect between what he could have done and what he actually did. He was really going through the process. And in going through that process, did not take the opportunity to engage that client in a conversation. And particularly when those sensitive subjects of domestic violence came up, when he really had an opportunity to build that rapport and show the client that he was her partner in progressing through the process and that he was going to be there for her, missed that opportunity, really missed the opportunity to go deep into that particular scenario so that he could maybe provide some assistance or resources or some support in that particular issue. So we're going to talk a little bit about that today. I really appreciate everyone's feedback on that. So we're going to review some of the poll questions that we had from our previous webinar. One of the poll questions that we had is, what is the most difficult aspect of the appraisal process for you, the case manager? And the answers were engaging the client throughout the appraisal, asking sensitive and personal questions, or getting honest answers from clients. And the number one answer, as you can see here, was getting honest answers from clients. When we talk about evoking today, that's going to help a little bit in how we engage the client and how we ask certain questions that will hopefully, again, go more into depth into the conversation and then be able to get us more honest answers from the clients as we have that discussion. Which is more challenging to do with clients, engaging or focusing? Well over 70% of the participants from last week said it's focusing. And that makes sense, particularly when you combine it with the previous question of getting honest answers. If a client is not really locked in and they're not fully engaged and they've not yet bought into the partnership of the process, it's going to be a bit more difficult to keep them focused on what the bigger picture is. We'll talk a bit more about that today as well. What do you find more challenging with clients? Is it discussing goals or is it discussing skills? Well over 60% said discussing goals, which makes sense because when you think about the concept of goals versus skills, skills are a bit more linear. You can answer that question relatively easy. Goals, a bit more in depth, and so we're talking a lot about depth when we're talking about motivational interviewing, and it's a bit more subjective. So you will have to use evoking techniques and focusing techniques to get clients to really think about in, wider terms what their short-term goals and long-term goals are. So we'll talk about that a little more in-depthly today as well. The other question that we asked last week was, how well do you know motivational interviewing? And this was really interesting because close to 60% say, I know it pretty well. You've had training, you practice it regularly, and another 25% or so said they know it somewhat well. They're aware of it, but they struggle a little bit putting it into practice, but they are familiar with its foundational tenets. And so I want to talk about those percentages today. That's how we're going to kick off today's webinar. So as I just said, 60% of participants feel they know it pretty well and that they put it into practice. But folks in my field, trainers, we always want to understand the difference between how we measure what we know and what we do, understanding that sometimes those things are different. So we're going to do a little exercise to go over our depth of knowledge relative to motivational interviewing and how we put it into practice. So if you are able to grab just a quick sheet of scratch paper and a pen or pencil, that would be great. If you don't have a pen and paper handy, go ahead and try to keep track in your head, but I'm going to ask a few questions, and I want you to write just a simple yes or no, not complicated answers, just a simple yes or no. So I want you to ask yourself, when I am with my client, am I listening more than I'm talking? Do I summarize what I understand along with what I hear? Do I acknowledge that ambivalence is normal and change is hard? Do I value what the client brings to the table? Do I empathize with clients' barriers to change or progress? Do I ask permission to proceed? Do I remember the client is capable of success? Am I guiding my clients versus directing them? Do I refocus clients back to themselves versus others? And do I encourage clients to create their own solutions? So I'm going to leave it here for just a second if you need to read over these questions again. And if you can write down simply yes or no to each one of those. So let's see how we did. So we're going to take a quick poll. Please just click on the corresponding number to your answer. If you answered yes to 8 to 10 of those questions, click 1. If you answered yes to 5 to 7 of those questions, click 2. And if you answered yes to 4 or less, click 3. Now, know that polls are anonymous, so we will not know who's clicking what answer. So be as truthful as possible, and just let me know how many yes answers you had. Okay, I'm going to give it just another second. Folks are still answering. All right, we've got about 75% of the vote in, and right now it looks like 61% are saying they answered yes to 8 to 10 questions. 37% are saying they said yes to 5 to 7, and less than 2% said yes to 4 or less. And that's really good. That's expected because we know we have experts in the field who are well trained and who care about the clients that are in front of them. So we understand that that's probably close to accurate relative to how we are conducting ourselves in the field. However, I want to go over each question a little bit more with a little bit more context. So we're going to break each question down, and we're going to talk a little bit about what each question actually means. So the question, am I listening more than I'm talking? This is something we all know, but many times struggle to put into practice. There are a number of factors that can make this difficult, including distractions from both the client and the workplace itself. We know that there were a high percentage of folks who said that focusing clients was difficult. And sometimes you're just trying to get through the process because you've got a lot packed into your day. Many times the case manager may feel that they've heard it all before. We've all been there where we have worked with a host of folks over a number of years and the stories begin to sound the same. And so we think we already know what the answers and next steps are for the client. But this can hinder active listening and full engagement. Allowing the client to expound on their answers and create their own solutions is really a foundational tenet of motivational interviewing and rapport building. Do I summarize what I'm hearing and what I'm understanding? We know we all seek to be heard. Active listening to a client while also identifying their various strengths, aspirations, and positive qualities that are embedded in their dialogue. Sometimes you have to search for them. They don't come out right away, but they're embedded into the dialogue and the conversation that you're having. That allows the case manager to reflect back in an affirming manner through reflective affirmation. So let me give you a quick example of that. How many times have you been talking to your spouse or your partner and you're having a conversation, maybe a heated debate or an argument, and you say something and they say back what you said or what they think they heard you say. And the first thing that you say is, that's not what I said. Because what they heard is actually not either what you said or what you intended. So it's important that when you're summarizing back to a client, that it is not just what you're hearing, but also what you're understanding what you're hearing to mean. Are you acknowledging that initial ambivalence is normal and that change is hard? Ambivalence is the unresolved conflict between positive and negative behavior, and it can hinder forward action. It is the principal impediment to change, and yet it is a normal human trait. When you interpret ambivalence as denial or a character flaw, really the potential for conflict and resistance can increase dramatically for the client. So let's think about that in our lives. Most of us are ambivalent about something. You can think about that gym membership that you have that you've never gone to, someone in your family that may be a diabetic and yet they can't give up sweets. They're always having a piece of cake or donuts. Those individuals you know who may have tried to give up smoking 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 times, and it's increasingly difficult for them to do so. That's ambivalence. Many times we don't understand the definition of that, but ambivalence doesn't mean that you don't care. It really means more stuck in the middle. You're stuck between what you know you should do and what you're actually doing. And it is the impediment that all of us face whenever we're trying to make change. So acknowledging that ambivalence is normal, at least initially, and that change is hard is really important for the case manager to do to create that partnership with the client. Do I value what my client brings to the table? A fundamental component of motivational interviewing is understanding each client's unique perspective, their feelings, and their values. And it's really paramount that the case manager do that with the client so that you can build that rapport. You can't build rapport without that. Acceptance, while not necessarily approval or agreement, shows that you acknowledge the client is comprised of their experiences as a whole, that they're bringing a lot to the table, good, baggage, all of it. But you do not define them by their current circumstances, that you see them as a person, not as what they've done or what circumstance they may currently be in. Am I empathetic to my client's barriers to change or progress? Barriers are identified as problem-specific, not person-specific. There's an old saying that you say, if a person gets lung cancer, you don't blame the lung. So it's kind of the same concept, that when you look at problems as problem-specific or challenge-specific instead of a character flaw, then it becomes much more doable to talk about overcoming those challenges or correcting that behavior. Ask permission when appropriate. And this is something that, again, is one of those things that it seems easy to do, but it's sometimes a bit more difficult, particularly when we're dealing with resistance or clients who may be difficult. Clients can often give us conflicting answers, and so many times the best way to avoid conflict is to ask permission before you confront. A good example is something like, I want to make sure I'm understanding what you're sharing since this information seems different than what we discussed earlier. Do you mind if we circle back to our discussion about any mental health concerns? This is not confrontational, but it is saying, what I'm hearing is conflicting from what I heard earlier, and I'd like to circle back so that we can have another discussion and I can give you an opportunity to clarify. Do I remember that my client is capable of success? This is an easy one for most of us. We are all capable of success. Remembering that circumstance does not dictate character and that behaviors can change helps us stay focused on outcomes in the bigger picture. Am I guiding my clients versus directing them? To help ensure long-term success, it's important that clients have ownership throughout the process. Many times we may feel that we know the answers, but a case manager must use a guiding hand to help the client create their own goals and action steps versus constantly giving direction. Do I refocus clients back to themselves versus others? How often do we ask a client about a past job or a barrier and they focus on everyone but them? I can kind of feel the hands going up. They say things like, the boss didn't like them, family members weren't supportive, past relationships were always the other person's fault, always someone else, it was always something else, it was always some circumstance, but it's never really them. And that happens a lot. It's important that we have techniques to refocus the client back to their role in their own success, because ultimately that's what they can control. They can control themselves and their actions and what they do. So an example of refocusing and putting it in an evoking modality is, what lessons came out of that work experience that can better prepare you for your next job? We don't necessarily need to address everyone else. We need to refocus back on what they can do what lessons they learned, what things they can do differently going forward. And this is a fundamental part of the moving phase of MI, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through. Do I encourage clients to create their own solutions? Do I encourage the client to actualize their relevance in the change process and their responsibility in the growth process? And do I help them take ownership of their goals, which allows them to drive their own success? So now let's go back and just go back through those questions one more time now that we've had a bit more context. And I'm going to ask you one more time. If you go back through and re-answer those, do you have more yes answers or do you have more no answers? Does it stay the same? So this is a poll question. You can click the corresponding number, and we'll give you just a second. Great, we've got about 65% of the vote in. Give it another 5 seconds or so. All right, so it looks like about 67% or so stayed the same, which is excellent. 28% had more yes answers, so that's even better. And so this is us saying that we're not only knowledgeable about motivational interviewing, but we're actually putting it into practice. And that's important to know. So because of that, we're going to spend a little bit more time talking about how we put it into practice and some of the mastery of those techniques versus what motivational interviewing actually is, because it appears that most of us in the field are very familiar with that. But understanding the difference between knowledge and behavior is not only important for us, but it's important in our relationship with our clients. And so how do we know? How do we know the difference between identifying knowledge and identifying behavior? I'm a trainer, and so many times I start off a training with this question. I'll ask everyone in the class, how many people know that it is important to get to work on time? Every day. How many people know that? And just about everyone, without exception, 100% will raise their hand. When I dig a little deeper and ask another question and say, okay, 100% of you know that it's important to get to work on time every day. How many of you have gotten to work on time every day for the past 2 weeks? Still get a number of hands that are up, but a few hands go down. When I go a little deeper and I say, how many of you have gotten to work on time every day for the past year? Quite a few hands go down. Only a couple of hands stay up. That is how we identify the difference between knowledge and behavior. And that spot in the middle is where ambivalence comes in. It's that place in the middle that conflicts with what we know and what we do. Knowledge can be imparted, but it can also be static. It doesn't necessarily move. When it moves, it becomes behavior. Behavior can be guided by knowledge, but it's always active and it's always intrinsic. Knowledge is something that can come from outside. Behavior is intrinsic. It comes from within. A primary purpose of case management is to help close the gap between what a client knows and what they do. So we're going to talk a little bit about the two final phases of motivational interviewing today, evoking and moving. Evoking helps to elicit the client's own motivations to promote change, and it requires questioning. You can't evoke without questioning. And that question helps to encourage self-discovery. We'll talk a little bit about how you create evoking questions going through the appraisal process. The moving phase of motivational interviewing is the outcome-based phase of MI. While everything in motivational interviewing is outcome-focused, the moving phase is where it really gets put into place. The client begins to frame their own follow-up steps and action items as they go through the appraisal process. So here are some evoking question starters. We talked a little bit last week about how just changing a couple things about how we have conversations will help us put our motivational interviewing techniques into practice. One of the things that you do is you ask open-ended questions. Evoking questions are almost always open-ended. So you can say, how can we? How should we? Let's look at. Next will. We can come back to that. How has that? Let's talk about. We'll work on that. And those are really good starters to opening a dialogue. Evoking starts with a question, but the question is really just to trigger a conversation so that the person is really rather forced to expound on their answers. So motivational interviewing with a conversational approach really puts the right questions forward so that you can get that client talking about in an in-depth way some of the answers that you need to do a full and comprehensive appraisal. So if they have some resistance to the process initially, you can say, what concerns you most about the process? How could this impact your ability to job search when negative behaviors are coming to the forefront? Or how can we address that going forward, particularly if they've missed something or haven't done something in the process that's required? When you're going through the appraisal process, when you go through OCAT, you'll see that there are sections there that really do require a yes or no question, but those are actually quite minimal. Most of OCAT will allow you to use multiple methods. So we call it multiple methods, not multiple choice. There are a number of opportunities to create space between what you see on the screen and what you actually say to the client. You can use engaging dialogue, which creates a two-way conversation, combination questioning, which combines two or more questions together, and observation and nonverbal cues, and we're going to talk about all three of those. So combination questioning is really just taking the questions in OCAT and combining them together because, as we said, when you've gone through the engaging process, you've already started a conversation. So these multiple questions into one should be relatively easy. You could say something like, you have 3 children living at home, right? Your 2 sons and your nephew. Do any of them have any disabilities or special needs, or have there been any health or mental health issues or concerns that we should talk about? This delivery takes about 5 to 6 seconds. It covers several questions throughout OCAT, and it feeds into other questions, particularly if the answer is yes. So if the answer is, well, yes, my oldest son, Mark, has been diagnosed with attention deficit disorder, that feeds easily into the behavioral and school discussion. So here's a particular screenshot of one of the sections in OCAT, which is the substance use section. So if we take a minute to look at this, all of you are, I'm sure, quite familiar with this screen. It has questions on there about alcohol and drug use. It has questions about how many drinks you use containing alcohol or whether you use medication other than as it's prescribed. So we're going to talk a little bit about how to approach this section in a more conversational way. One of the first things that you can do is not use the word substance use, which we've talked about before. You could say things like lifestyle and social habits. So as you transition out of one section into another section, particularly sections that are considered sensitive subjects, you may want to reframe the dialogue. That's what we call engaging dialogue. So you could say something like, all right, let's talk a little bit about your lifestyle and social habits. Do you drink alcohol? Yes? Okay. About how many drinks do you have per week? Is it 4 or more? Okay, more than 4. Is it generally 3 or 4 a day or more than that? Okay, so you usually just have a beer with dinner. So that's 1 a day? Got it. So I've had that conversation. I start with 4 or more times per week. I don't go through the list. I start with the one that's the highest and I work my way back. Then when it comes to how many per day, I start in the middle and give them an opportunity to say less or more. And then I wrap it up with confirming what I just heard. That's more conversational than saying, now we're in the substance use section. How often? Never, monthly or less, 2 or 4 times a month, 2 or 3 times per week. That's what we mean when we say either combine the questions or use engaging dialogue to just create a conversation. It's going to make the client much more comfortable in discussing some of these very sensitive topics and issues. So we've acknowledged case managers are the ones that are driving this process. You all are the ones with the expertise. And with that, we know that everything speaks. This is called the census versus census method. Census, as we know, is just pure collection of data. And that's really not what the appraisal is. And so since you're looking for information that is much more in-depth And we've already acknowledged that getting honest answers is sometimes very difficult in gleaning that from a client. We really have to use all of our skills and expertise and all of our senses. That means we're paying attention to nonverbal cues. We're paying attention to the client's demeanor. We're paying attention to if they become less forthcoming than they were 5 minutes ago. Do they now feel nervous? When you looked at the OCAD video, the client who came in seemed pretty forthcoming. She seemed like she was pretty amenable to answering the questions, and she became quite uncomfortable when the subject of domestic violence came up. That case manager did not pick up on those cues, and he did not pick up on those nonverbal communications that the client was giving at that particular time. So it's important that we pay attention to those things. When you use your senses, there may not be a particular question that you can answer in OCAD, or the client may not be willing to answer that question. That's where the notes function comes in and is very, very helpful. It is important that if you identify something or you sense something, even if it's a nonverbal cue, it may be something that you want to notate. And so every section of OCAT has a notes function that you can go in as a case manager and write what you think may be a nonverbal cue that the client is giving you, or something that you may want to go back and review, or something that you may want to circle back with later on in the interview. Many times when we're bringing up sensitive subjects, it also brings up resistance. And we again talked about how it's difficult to keep a client focused, and it's many times difficult to keep them focused, particularly if we're dwelling in the areas that they're not comfortable talking about. So case managers should learn how to roll with that resistance. Instead of meeting it head on, we have to de-escalate it by rolling with it and refocusing. So when we really think about it, the requirements of the program that every client has to follow to participate really remain unchanged. They remain unchanged whether the client is resistant or not, whether the client is friendly, whether they're not, the requirements remain the same. So there really isn't a power struggle between the case manager and the client. All of the power, as far as requirements, is really on the side of the organization and the program. So when there's resistance, it's really an opportunity for growth and development of the partnership. How you guide it will have a lot to do with how that client will react going forward. So when navigating through resistance, we want to think of it more as a dance instead of a wrestling match. We really want to look at it as an opportunity to show that client that we are on their side. So remember that resistance and conflict can be the same thing, but conflict really requires two people. If only one person is resistant, it's merely a challenge to overcome. It becomes a conflict when it's engaged upon. So we're going to talk a little bit about the moving phase of motivational interviewing. This is the outcome-based phase of MI, as we talked about earlier. And this is when the client and the case manager really begin to frame the follow-up steps and action steps that are going to be attached to everything that they've identified throughout the appraisal process. You're going to talk about what the client needs to work on, what their short and long-term goals are, what action steps to be taken, and what follow-up plans should be followed. Now, this is a longer process than the appraisal. It's where it starts, but we know that there are going to be multiple steps going forward. And that's when some of the questions that we asked earlier about directing and guiding and remembering that there are barriers and understanding that they can be successful, the moving phase is where we really implement a lot of those tenets, because it takes patience as that client goes through their process and follows along with their action steps. So we're going to talk a little bit about the employment section and how to have some conversationally engaged dialogue when you get to this particular section. So type your answers into the chat box and look at this screenshot. This is the employment section or one of the screens in the employment section of OCAT, and it's reasons for not working. So the interesting thing that you'll see on this screen is that it specifically says, do not read the list aloud. Check all that apply. And so since you're not going to read the list, you really do have to engage in a conversation with the client to really get to the root of some of the reasons that they're not currently working. So give me some examples in the chat box, if you don't mind, about what you would say to engage that client in a conversation and get them started in talking about why they're not currently working. And you can go ahead and type your answers into the chat box. Okay. I'm going to start reading some of those answers. And I do appreciate all of the participation. Thank you, guys. So what kind of work have you done is an easy conversation starter. They can start talking about it. What would you say some of your primary reasons for not currently working are? That's a good conversation starter as well. What happened at your last job? Tell me, I'm sorry, just a second. Tell me some of the reasons why you left. That's a really good conversation starter as well. Those are all really good answers. What kind of work have you done? And let's revisit why your last job ended. And tell me about what you've been doing since then. That's a great one. Why are you no longer with this employer? And why did you leave your previous job? Is there anything specific going on right now that's preventing you from seeking employment? That's a really good one as well. This is a really good one. So we've discussed that you aren't currently working. Can we talk about the reasons you aren't working right now? Did you leave your employer on good terms? It's been a while since you've worked. Can you tell me more about what you did then and how that job or your previous jobs have ended? So these are all really, really good answers. I want you to take a look at those and really focus on those that allow the client to give you an answer that does not automatically mean that they did something wrong. And so many times when we say, why aren't you working? Psychosomatically, that's telling me that you're saying, I'm not working because of something that I did. So posing the question, as many of you did, to say, can you tell me about your last job? What were the reasons that that job ended? Or say something like, it looks like you haven't worked in a while. Is there something going on right now that's preventing you from seeking employment? And then you can circle back to why those previous jobs ended. But asking it in a neutral fashion so that that client can then feel more comfortable being honest. It's a normal reaction for humans to become defensive very quickly. If my mind clicks and thinks that you are somehow judging or accusing, it's a natural response for me to want to take a defense stance and defend myself mentally and say, well, it wasn't my fault. Well, you know, they laid me off, or my boss didn't like me, or, you know, my kid was sick, and to say that in a real defensive tone. When you ask it in a neutral way, and you say, tell me a little bit more about that job. Is that a job that you liked? Was it something that you didn't like about it? That helps you evoke those questions to get more truthful and honest answers. So a lot of you did a great job in putting those questions in there. I really appreciate that. So the next slide that we're going to talk about is how to summarize the appraisal process while you transition into the action phase of the process. Because we know summarizing the appraisal is not the end. Summarizing the appraisal just means, oh, I apologize, guys. Hold on just a second. I'm sorry, something happened with my computer there. I don't know what that was. I apologize for that. All right, so summarizing the interview and the appraisal process is really just the beginning of the action steps. And so it's important that when you summarize, you give that client an opportunity to participate fully in that process. Because as we just discussed, they're going to be transitioning fully into the moving phase, and they have to be engaged and on board for that phase to be successful. So when we think about that, what kind of questions can we ask? And this is just a really quick example. And know that when I give you these examples of how we can rephrase some of this is not to say that you should say it this way. We talked about it in the last webinar, is that it has to be very genuine and very honest to who you are. So your tonalities, your idiosyncrasies, the words that you use, your vernacular, even some of the slang words that you use really do have to be genuine to you. So word this however you are most comfortable. But this is an example of how we can close out the appraisal process and transition into the actions phase. So we've gotten a lot of information today, particularly around some of the things that may be holding you back from long-term employment. What are any areas we've missed or additional things we should touch on before we talk about next steps? This gives the client an opportunity to summarize everything that you've heard. Now, many times they may say, no, I'm good, nothing. If they don't have anything to add, then it gives you, the case manager, an opportunity to circle back to some of the things that you've notated throughout the interview process. So if they don't have anything to add, then you can say, well, there was one thing I really wanted to circle back on really quickly. I just want to make sure I got enough information about that. And you go back to that section and you give them another opportunity to provide additional information. So moving towards outcomes. Again, everything in motivational interviewing, everything throughout the appraisal process is outcome focused. It's the whole purpose for the appraisal. The appraisal is not there just to collect data. It is outcome driven and it is outcome focused. But for it to be successful, the client must have input in and take ownership of their goals and their action steps. This is what we call decisional balance. It creates that balance between the case manager and the client, where the case manager is guiding, but the client understands that the responsibility is theirs. It's important for the case manager to keep plans focused and targeted. Both the client and case manager should stay flexible and realistic in terms of client abilities and timelines. You want to encourage the client to develop well-defined short and long-term goals by reflecting back the positive aspirations garnered from the appraisal. So remember when we talked about a couple of slides ago where you have to many times pull out the positive aspirations that come out in the dialogue that the client doesn't even necessarily know that they're sharing. It really is our responsibility to translate some of the information that they're sharing with us in a positive way that we know can help in their outcomes and their goals. They may not yet be able to verbalize or articulate that, but because of your expertise, you'll know when that information is shared, well, this is going to be helpful or this is going to be a barrier, and you can help share that with them as you develop those action steps. Barriers should be addressed via multiple action steps. We know that if a barrier were easy to remove, clients wouldn't need our help in doing it. And so when we look at barrier removal, we have to be realistic in not only the time, but the action steps that it's going to take to get it rectified completely. We may be able to do some things short term, and then we may have some other action steps that are more long term. This is where the appraisal summary report in the OCAT appraisal can be very helpful. It provides a foundation to guide the case manager and the client relationship that is strengths-based and is focused on client needs and input. It contains realistic goals and activities and is driven by client agreement and participation. This is a screenshot of the appraisal summary report, and you can see here how it has identified some of the barriers and some of the issues that have been discussed throughout the appraisal process and has populated it with some recommendations. Now, the ASR is as good as the information that goes into it, and so that's why it's really important to practice that engaging dialogue so that you can get that in-depth information back. If it's accurate that we have difficulty getting honest answers from clients, and over 60% of us said that it is, then our evoking techniques are not yet where they should be, because evoking will help with that. That engaging dialogue and that methodology of conversational dialogue will make that client much more comfortable in answering our questions in a much more in-depth way. The ASR can be used to motivate the client with a hard copy document showing the strengths they possess and their resources and progress to date. So it's something that you can follow along. Remember, we said the moving phase is the outcome phase, and it's called moving for a reason. There are multiple steps, and there's a timeline that's attached to it. Measure success as the client progresses along with their self-sufficiency plan. It coordinates internal and external resources needed to ensure successful client service coordination and outcomes. And you can quickly share information on client status with interagency partners. It's only where those information sharing agreements exist. So it is something that is a tool that you can use to say, here's what we talked about and here's what we've agreed to. It also puts something directly in front of the client that they can take with them to say, here's what I'm responsible for. Here are the things that I agreed to do, and here are the timelines put into place. Here are also some resources that they've been able to provide me. So when you go back to engaging and you say you talked about what are the benefits of the program, and that's how we start out, and ASR is a really good way to showcase those benefits. Here's a tangible copy of the things that we've talked about, and here's what's going to happen after you walk out. Here are some resources, and here are some action steps, and here are the things we're going to follow up on. So it does a lot to solidify that concept of partnership. So we've talked about evoking and moving in motivational interviewing. Last week, we talked about engaging and focusing. And so we're going to go through and talk a little bit about some of the tips that you should remember when you're working with your clients on a day-to-day basis. Acknowledge ambivalence is the unresolved conflict between positive and negative behaviors and is a normal human trait. Ensure that we're always valuing what the client brings to the table through their life experience and their fortitude. You want to roll with resistance by meeting resistance to process with reflection of purpose. Almost always, if a client is resistant, they're resistant to the process, not the purpose. They're there for a reason. They're there because they have a need. So something about the process or something about their interaction or something about their engagement has created a blockade, and rolling with that and dealing with that in a neutral way and navigating through that is a way to de-escalate that resistance. You want to redirect potential conflict by offering new perspectives. Shift negative perceptions through positive affirmations. And it's not just negative perceptions of the process, it's many times negative perceptions of themselves. Clients don't know that they have the capabilities or the skill set or the opportunities that they could have in front of them. So reframing the information that we get throughout the appraisal process and reflecting it back in what we call reflective affirmations is a great way for clients to understand that they can be successful. Use all of the case manager senses to ascertain information and encourage the client to develop and drive their own goals and action steps. Questions? All right, we are going to open it up to questions right now. And we have plenty of time, so please feel free to type your questions into the chat box. Anything that you had a question from previously that we weren't able to get to yet, I'll try to address those as quickly as I can. All right, let's get down to some of the new questions. I apologize. This question box on the webinar is very small, so I'm scrolling through it right now. Give me just a second. All right. Okay, can we get an example of, I'm sorry, do we have somebody else on the line? We may have Patrick or Nicole. There we go. I apologize. Okay, so can we get an example of rolling with resistance? Absolutely. This is something I inquire quite a bit. So if you remember on one of the slides, the first question that was there when we talked about evoking is, what's your concern about the process? A great way to roll with the resistance when someone says, y'all are making me jump through all of these hoops, or I can't believe you did that, or this is unnecessary, or this is some nonsense. Well, what's concerning you about the process? What's the biggest issue that you have right now? A great way to roll with resistance is to pose it in the form of a question. Because when you pose it in the form of a question, it requires the client to respond. And if you're asking a number of questions calmly, eventually they're going to have to calm down because they're going to have to keep answering them. And so you just follow a question with a question with a question. Because if you try to engage in a conversation, then that resistance can turn into conflict, because then they can debate the statements that you're making. You can't debate a question. You have to answer the question. So that is an excellent way to roll with it. If you notice, the term isn't fix resistance or combat resistance, it's rolling with it. You many times have to see it through to its natural end. And so to do that, asking questions over and over again, well, I understand what you said, however, I'm still trying to figure out what is the thing that is troubling you the most. We may not be able to fix everything today, but I'm really interested in what you're most uncomfortable with, or what is making you most upset at this particular point. So can I ask a question about this? Well, can we see if we can talk about this? Posing it in the form of a question requires that client to dialogue with you, but they're not going to be able to be combative because they can't combat a statement when you're merely asking a question. Hopefully that helps. So using reflection of purpose, someone asked to share an example of that, and that's a really good question as well. And so when we talk about things sensitively, such as if a person does have a substance abuse issue, or they do have issues with recreational drugs or things like that, it's really important to take the judgment out of it. And so I work a lot with young people, and one of the things that we talk about is, particularly around substance use, is the judgment that's attached to that. And so many times you can combat the resistance and combat any conflict by saying, well, I understand you're frustrated. However, if we looked at what we talked about, getting a job in the next 3 months was something that was really, really important to you. And to do that, you're going to have to pass a drug test. And so as frustrating as it may seem, it's really something that we have to address and we have to talk about, because if we don't, you're not going to be able to meet that goal that you set. So let's talk about that. Is this a realistic goal? When you pose it in that and reflect back to the goals that they set or what they said they wanted, if they said, I really, really want to be able to stay at home with my children after they get out of school, but they don't want the job that's right there in front of them, we can talk about that. I know this may not be your ideal job right now, but it could be a stepping stone, because you said the most important thing was being home with the kids after they got out of school, because you don't have reliable childcare. So if that's still your priority, we have to look at the options that are in front of us. So really reflecting back to what they said they wanted is critical. So what do you do if the client does not have time to complete the appraisal in the middle of doing the appraisal? We run into that a lot, don't we? Clients are not focused. They didn't allot enough time to go through the appraisal process. And there's really not a whole lot you can do except to remind the client that this is critical and tell them we're going to reschedule another appointment. However, you need to be aware that in the next appointment, it's going to take this much time, and you really do have to allocate for that much time, because it's really important that we get all of this information in. This is how we can best help you. Always take it back to this is how we can best help you. There is a reason that you are asking for certain things. There is a reason that you're asking certain questions. It's not to be intrusive. It's not to get them to jump through hoops. It's not to get them to meet some arbitrary requirement. Ultimately, at the end of the day, everything that you're doing is to help them. So at the end of every process, if you close with that, people understand the why. They're much more aligned with the what and the how. Okay, so there's a question in here that says, is it possible to have moved or to relocate as one of the options for not working? I'm not sure what that question is referencing, but I think it has something to do with the position of the screens on OCAT, and that's something that you can ask the question to the tech folks too, and they can give you an answer about that. Can you go back to the question about resistance and explain it? It was confusing. Okay. So resistance is not necessarily conflict. Resistance can come in a number of fashions. It can come very passive aggressively, where a client is just refusing to engage. They're answering yes or no. They're not expounding on any answers. Or resistance can be much more aggressive and much more out front. It really comes in a number of different facets, but you'll know it when you see it. You'll know whether a client is not engaged and is resistant to the process, or is combative, or is not focused, or particularly is not being honest. Not being honest and forthcoming is also a form of resistance. And so you're going to have to use a number of different techniques. When we have a person that's not giving us honest answers, we really do have to use the evoking methodology a bit more. When we have a person who's simply giving us yes or no answers, we have to use the engaging function a bit more. When we have an individual who's combative, we have to use the focusing function a bit more and get them back on track. And so as we talked about last week, motivational interviewing is really a toolkit, and you use it intermittently based on the client that's in front of you. Some clients will need a bit more engaging methodology. Some clients will need a bit more evoking. Some clients will do very well until they get to the moving phase. And you'll be quite surprised. You'll say the appraisal process went really well. They seemed excited about setting their goals, and yet they haven't done any follow through. And so that's why we look at it as a toolkit, and you pull those tools out as you need them to deal with each client that's in front of you. Okay. Another question is, a lot of times at the end of OCAT, a client is not providing a lot of information to help develop their plan. It generally tends to be making the plan, how can I elicit their participation in the development of their action plan? That is a really great question. And so one of the techniques that you want to use with motivational interviewing in helping to develop that plan is to go back with the reflective affirmation. So this is saying, all right, well, I didn't get a lot of feedback for what you really wanted your short and long-term goals are, but when we talked about it, you seem to be really interested in working on cars and auto mechanics. Is that something you can see yourself doing long-term? Well, yeah, but, you'd have to go to school for that. I can't really afford that. Okay, well, let's cross that bridge when we get there, but we at least know that that's something that you're interested in. And so we know that to do that, you probably have to get some additional training. So let's look at some training opportunities. There are a lot of things that you can do. So really going back, it's going to be difficult for that client sometimes to create what they want their goals to be. It doesn't mean that they don't know them. They're going to have difficulty articulating them because they may have low levels of self-efficacy. And we talked about that in part 1 of the webinar. Many of our clients come to us with very low levels of self-efficacy. And self-efficacy is that internal thing that tells us that we can. And until those levels increase, they're not only not going to believe that they can do certain things, they're not going to know that they can do certain things. Part of that process in developing that action plan is to help that self-efficacy increase internally so that they begin to have a belief system and they begin to be able to articulate some of the things that they want and some of their aspirations. And that's really why OCAT is so comprehensive. You may have looked at it initially last year when it was first kicked off and said, this is ridiculous, all of these questions. But the reality is, it is important that we have a tool and a mechanism to help pull that out of a client because they are not necessarily able to articulate it yet on their own. They eventually will be, but it's just not something that they've been asked to do or have ever had to do in that fashion. Okay. When going over the recommendations, it sometimes states providing a referral to a physician or a financial management workshop. When customers ask for these referrals, we don't have the resources to provide the customers. What should we do? That really is an organizational, conversation, and it's difficult. And we find this all across the country. In every state that we go to, there are more needs than resources, and we know that to be true. And so, again, the case manager is the expert. If something comes out that you know you don't have the resource for, that's an internal conversation that you want to have, and you may want to make some adaptations to that. To say that may not be something we can address in this fashion right now, but encourage the client to be their own advocate and say there are resources out there. We don't necessarily have one to refer you to, but you may want to do some research on that to see what organizations out there can provide you some assistance. Be perfectly comfortable in engaging the client in their own self-advocacy and their own action. There are going to be some things that you can do directly in reference to resources, and there are going to be some things that you have to recommend to them that they do on their own, and that's fine. How do you address resistance to mental health referrals? That's a really good question. And all you can do is continue that evoking process and that moving process. And so again, let's go back to understanding that ambivalence is normal, and particularly when the knowledge is not even yet there. You may not believe that you have a mental health issue, or you may believe that you have it under control. And so it is really difficult to get a person into an action-based phase or a moving phase if they've not yet accepted that they have a problem. So that's an area where the case manager has to continue to notate and has to continue to address with the client throughout the process. So that means we go back, and when we have a conversation with them, we have another conversation. And when they do one action step, we have another conversation. Because if we believe this to be a continuing issue that's a barrier to employment, we have to continue to address it. You have to continue to address it in a non-judgmental, neutral, non-combative way, but you have to continue to address it. Because there are some things that we're going to have a conversation about, and the client's going to be very, very open. As we talked about last week, some clients will emote, and they love to share their life in living color. They love to answer all of our questions. They love to tell us everything. And there are some clients who are going to say some things that will trigger a response to say, this is probably an issue, a challenge, or a barrier that we should address, but they're not quite ready. And sometimes we have to be okay with that. It's important that you notate it, it's important that you follow up on it, and it's important that you circle back to it. And ultimately, those are the things that we can do to get that client to accept what that challenge is and seek help. We have been instructed not to allow the client to see the screen when asking questions. How important is that, and to what extent should we be enforcing that? It's really important. If we look at some of the techniques that we talked about when we talked about that engaging dialogue, if I see a screen that says substance use, the first thing I'm going to say is, I don't use substances. What is that screen? But if you say, let's talk about your lifestyle, and do I drink, that's a completely different conversation. And so it is really important, because most of OCAT you're going to be reframing and you're going to be combining. And so the client doesn't necessarily need to see the screen, and then it can also kind of defeat the purpose of what you're trying to do. So you should definitely be enforcing that. And then we talked a little bit last week about how important positioning is, and physicality, and whether the client is in front of you, and those types of things. And so incorporate your own techniques, what works for you. I'm a person who I don't type very quickly, so I tend to take notes, and then I say, you know what, give me a second. I want to make sure I get this in the system and I don't forget anything, and I type it in. Some of you may be able to type and look at the client at the same time. It really is based on what works best for you. But OCAT is really a guide for the case manager. It's not necessarily something for the client to see. It's your guide to ensure that you're covering all the bases and that you're asking all of the appropriate questions, but it allows you to be the driver so that you can determine how, when, and where you ask those questions throughout the process. How can we make skills and interest section more conversational? That's a good question. Generally, in the skills and interest section, I tend to say engaging it the same way you do the employment section, where you just start having a conversation, and maybe you write down, okay, so landscaping, all right, because the answers can be quite infinite, actually. There can be tons of answers out there. And so really just using one of those evoking questions just to trigger a conversation is probably ideal in that section, because you really don't know what the responses are going to be. And then as they give you responses, using that as an opportunity to expound on that and maybe even feed into other areas about employment, et cetera. So just really kind of just starting it out with a conversation. It's difficult to combine questions in that area. So you just may want to evoke a conversation and engage in a dialogue. I'm sorry, someone says they can't hear me. I apologize for that. I hope that's a little bit better. OCAT prompts you to ask the customer if they want parenting classes, etc. Where will we get this information from as far as referrals for our customers? That is actually an internal question that you would want to ask organizationally. Unfortunately, that's not information that I have. I apologize for that. If a PT is identified as MHDV or SA, and they're in the priority level but refuse the services, what steps can we take? You know, again, that's more of an organizational question, but the first thing that I would say is you want to notate that they are refusing services. You also want to notate if they're refusing to answer questions so that you can go back to your notes. Take notes of any nonverbal cues, take notes of any responses so that you have that to refer back to when you have an internal conversation about what the next step should be. You always want to ensure the safety of your clients, and so you want to have an internal conversation about what should happen, but you want to make sure that that client is not uncomfortable. Even if they're refusing service, still stay in the motivational interview mode that we are in this together. I'm here to help you. I'm here to be as supportive as I can. Understand that, I understand this really may be, a sensitive topic and that you may be going through some struggles, but I want you to know I'm here for you and we're going to do everything we can to help you. And then figure out internally what those next steps are. But in that particular sense, there may be things that are said or information that is shared that there's nowhere for you to check that box. And so that's where the note section is going to come in very handily. Okay. Next question. How do we address couples where culturally only one of them answers questions or will not allow case managers to meet alone with each of the adults? That's an interesting question, and we do see that a lot. The reality is culturally, if that's their culture, that's something that has to be respected. But again, you can still notate nonverbal cues. That's where motivational interviewing and paying attention to all of the senses that are going on in that dynamic is really important. That person who's not speaking may still be giving off nonverbal cues. They could still show you that they're uncomfortable or that they're perfectly comfortable in this scenario because this scenario is normalized for them. So it's important that we respect those cultural differences. If you identify that there may be an issue, then you want to have an internal conversation about, do I schedule a separate appointment? What are some of the next steps that I can do to maybe address this? And it's going to be different from client to client. Okay, I think those were all of the questions that I saw. If I missed your question, just type into the chat box you missed me, and I will go back through. But I hopefully have answered all of the questions at this point. If there are any remaining questions, please type those into the chat box at this time, and I'm happy to answer those. All right, and we're going to go on to the next slide. So Patrick or Nicole, if you'd like to jump in and talk a little bit about the OCAT Help Desk and share that information with the folks. Hello?
All right, yep, this is Nicole. So if you have any questions as you're using the tool, most of you should be familiar with the OCAT Help Desk right now, but we're here to answer any of your questions. We have an email address and a phone number listed, so feel free to contact us if you're stumped.
Great. Awesome. So thanks, everyone, for joining us. Again, I know it's hard to be on a webinar, particularly if there's only one voice droning on for an hour and a half. So I do appreciate everyone's participation and engagement. There were some amazing questions out there. I appreciate that. It's our opportunity to share with the field and folks in other offices maybe some of the same questions and issues they may be having. And we also really appreciate your feedback. At ICF, we want to ensure that the webinars that are developed are really focused on the areas that are important to you and that we're sharing information that you think is important, valid, and is useful out there every day in the work that you're doing. So there is an evaluation here. Please feel free to evaluate this webinar today, and we're always excited to get feedback about what we can do better and what additional information you'd like us to share with you. Okay, and there are some additional questions here. So let me try to get to those while folks are answering the poll. One of the questions is, can you recommend reading material for MI? The first place I'd tell you to start is actually in the Learning Center. There's some in-depth information there. And then also you'll find the full training that was done last year when OCAT was actually initialized in your state. So there is a full-on PowerPoint presentation that not only includes information about OCAT, but that goes really in-depth with motivational interviewing and how to impart it every day with your clients. We'll also be adding some additional information to the Learning Center about motivational interviewing and how we can master those techniques. Because as we talked about, there's a difference between what we know and what we do. Our knowledge can be thorough, it can be exhaustive, but we may not necessarily have mastered the skill at this point. And that's really what we're focusing on, mastery of the skill, knowing that how we interact and how we engage with our clients is really integral to their long-term success. They may not know it walking through the door, and they may not know it even when they're sitting there throughout the appraisal process, but we know it. We know that it's helpful. And so how we master these techniques are going to be really, really important. And we'll also provide some additional links on the Learning Center for increased information and some reading material that you can get. There's also, I believe, a tip sheet, motivational interviewing, that is there that we've recommended that folks print off, and you can keep it right there at your desk. And so it's a just list and reminder of some of the tips of motivational interviewing that you can have right in front of you. There's a question here about how I access the Learning Center, and the slide that we just had previously with the hotline, OCAT ICF, or the hotline phone number, is a good place to go to get that information. And can you provide more information on the action plan? Actually, the ICF help desk can help you with that as well, and they can get that right to you. Okay, I think there are, there's some more feedback. Perhaps not read too much from the PowerPoint presentation, and I absolutely agree with you. Webinars are the least interactive modality of the trainings that we do, and sometimes it's a little difficult to engage our participants. So you all have been a very engaging and participatory audience, and I really do appreciate that. And it's sometimes a struggle to measure between how much we have a dialogue and conversation and how much we read from the PowerPoints. But we do want the PowerPoints to be helpful and thorough because, as I said, it's going to be on the Learning Center and you can refer back to them at any time. And hopefully that information there will continue to provide assistance, help, resources, and information as you go throughout your work with your clients every day. Okay. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to our wonderful organizers, Patrick or Nicole, so that we can close it out.
Nope, I think that closes out, Chantel. Thanks again so much for your presentations, and thanks everyone for taking the time to sit in and participate. So thanks to everyone.
All right. Thanks, guys. Have a wonderful day.